you as you really are, and we want our lives to be transformed as a result. Would you meet with us today, we pray, in your precious name. Amen. Amen. So, Resurrection Sunday, it isn't too much kind of going too far to say that this is the high point of our calendar. It's more significant than Christmas, and yet it is only significant if we see who Jesus really is. And we can be kept from seeing who he really is and what he's like by our expectations of him. And that'll depend on our previous experiences of him. Because I guess the truth is that we all kind of come a little bit preloaded with stuff when it comes to Jesus. You know, if we don't believe that Jesus was a real historical person who actually lived, then that creates expectations that stops us from seeing who he really is. If we've been exposed to a kind of a white nationalist Jesus that's being touted in the States and increasingly here, then that creates expectations that will stop us from seeing who he really is. I think closer to home, if we've experienced people who claim to follow Jesus and do hurtful things in his name because he told them to, then that creates expectations that stops us from seeing who he really is. So, maybe you've never rejected Jesus, but maybe you've never really seen why he mattered. Expectations have got the power to alter what we see. Expectations are really that powerful. So there was a couple of psychologists that did an experiment a few years back where they got a bunch of people in a room to watch a video of a basketball being passed back and forth, and they had to count how many times the basketball was passed back and forth. And at the end of the video, they were given the correct answer. This is the number of passes. And then they were asked the question, did you see the gorilla? Because halfway through the video, this 400-pound gorilla walks on, goes like that, and then walks off the other side. Do you know, you look at that and you think, well, that's ridiculous. Of course I'd notice the gorilla. 50% of people do not notice the gorilla. And they don't notice the gorilla because they're not expecting it. If they don't expect to see a gorilla, then they won't. And often what we expect to see can blind us to what's really there. And that is exactly what's going on in the story that the kids have just read to us, that story of the first Easter Sunday. And here's the thing. You know, if all of that really happened, then there is nothing more important than seeing who Jesus really is. And to do that then, just like the kind of early disciples, we may need to have our expectations of Jesus changed. Now I say it that way around quite deliberately because I don't know if you noticed, they were on an actual road, but then Jesus kind of took them on this kind of road to revelation. He was the one that opened their eyes. He was the one that changed their expectations. And that Jesus that opened eyes then is still opening eyes now. So let's go on a journey. Now we meet these disciples on the road to a place called Emmaus. And right at the start it says, that very day. Well, what very day? Well, it was the first Easter Sunday. And what the kids didn't read to us is that what had happened prior to this was Good Friday. Jesus had been executed. His followers had endured a really kind of a miserable Sabbath, the Saturday in between. And then some of his followers had gone to the tomb to embalm his body, to give him a proper send-off, I guess. And then they got there, and they found that the body had gone. Now, imagine you're one of those followers. How bewildering is this? You know, this has confounded all your expectations. And 4 times in pretty quick succession, Luke says, this happened, this happened, this happened, then this happened. And he's using that word really deliberately. Because, you know, sometimes it feels like that, doesn't it? It feels like life is happening to us. It's kind of like wave after wave after wave of overwhelming, bewildering, disorienting things that are happening to us. And these 2 people that are walking down the road, somebody asked me on Friday, do you reckon it was a man and a woman, or do you reckon it was 2 men? I haven't got a clue. So it doesn't tell us, okay? So you know, if I say these guys at any point this morning, I'm not saying that they were blokes. It's just because I use guys as a generic term, right? I don't know. It might have been a man and a woman. It might have been 2 women. No, actually, it's definitely 1 man because one of them's called Cleopas, which is a man's name. But anyway, you get the point, right? So please forgive me if I do say guys. But anyway, these 2 guys, they're kind of wrestling with some stuff that is absolutely bewildering. These are really confusing happenings. Their expectations of Jesus being Messiah, Jesus being Christ, they pictured that what Jesus was going to do was that he was going to rescue their nation. He was going to do something spectacular. Now, bear in mind, they'd seen him do lots of miracles. They knew that Jesus was special. But their hopes had died with Jesus. And now the women in their group are saying that the grave is empty. And graves don't just get emptied. This is huge stuff. And you know, there's such a kind of ring of truth to the way that Luke's written this. Because what do? They're talking. And then they're talking and they're discussing. And you know when stuff happens that we just haven't got a clue what's going on? It's one of our drives as humans that we need to try and make sense of what is senseless. And so what do? We just kind of blurt it all out and we talk and we discuss. And actually that word discussing can mean they were disputing. They were maybe even having beef about what had taken place in that whole weekend. It's like, well, I saw it this way. No, I saw it this way. Well, I don't know what's going on. Do you know what's going on? I don't know what's going on. And these disciples, just like us, they're trying to make sense of what is senseless. They're spewing it all up in order to try and just put some kind of shape and order on what they've seen. And you know, whether it's those big kind of generational moments, you know, like for my parents' generation, I remember where I was when I heard about President Kennedy. And then for our generation, I guess it's more kind of, do you remember 9/11? Do you remember where you were when you heard? And then for the younger generation still, then it's probably more, where were you when you heard that Boris was shutting us up in our house for 3 weeks or 3 months or what felt like 3 years? You know, and we talk about these things and we try and make sense of what's going on. But then sometimes it comes closer to home and we're talking about things that are far more personal losses and tragedies. And part of being human is that we just need to discuss and to talk and to spill our guts and to just cry out, what the heck is going on? And as these guys are spilling it all out, they're walking away from where it all happened. And this direction is really important. In Luke's account of Jesus' life, every time you're pointed towards the action, you're always going towards Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where all of the kind of key stuff takes place. But now they're going in the other direction. These guys are going in the wrong direction. And they're not just walking away from a city. They're walking away from a story that they thought that they understood. But then, pivot. It happened in their talking and discussing that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. Well, great. You know when we're in these moments of confusion and grief, we often need someone from outside of our situation to help us to process it. We need somebody who's not within our kind of echo chamber of suffering that's going to bounce our confusion back at us. But actually, this isn't just somebody that's come to help them here, is it? This isn't just any old body that's going to help them to process their grief. This is the actual, impossible reversal of their grief in human skin, stood right with them. One glimpse of his face, and all of their crises dissolve. But there's a twist in the tale. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. They couldn't see Jesus. Now, these guys had been with him for at least a chunk of the last 3 years. Do you know, there's even one tradition that says that Cleopas might have been Jesus' uncle. In which case, if that's true, he'd have known Jesus for his whole life. And yet you've got these two people who are looking at Jesus, and they haven't got a clue who he is. To them, he's a stranger. So what's the deal? Because there's something weird going on here, isn't there? There's something else at play. And there's this really kind of curious phrase that their eyes were being, it wasn't that they just didn't recognize him, their eyes were being restrained. It's almost like something's got a hold on their eyes. I'd like to do a sort of modeling of this, but my fingers won't go through my glasses to kind of hold on to my eyeballs, you know? But that's the kind of description that's happening here. So what was it? What kept them from recognizing him? Was it that Jesus had some kind of disguise on? You know, is he playing with them? Is Jesus just kind of toying with them? Or is the problem on their end? And he said to them, "What is this conversation you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know these things that have happened in these days? Like, unknown stranger dude, are you the only person who's been blind to what's gone on these last few days? These are earth-shattering things. Haven't you been watching the news? And yet, they don't realize that the one that's with them is the news. But there's something deeper going on here too. God has always been a God who starts conversations. He's a communicating God. He's always the one who asks the questions, who makes the first move, just as Jesus does here. With us too, he's always the one that makes the first move. Do you not know these things that have gone on in these last few days? I love Jesus' reply here. What things? You know, talk to me about it. I'm the center of this, but just tell me anyway. But feel the confusion in Cleopas' reply. Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, there are things about Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. Like, he's got that right, doesn't he? Like, Cleopas clearly understands who Jesus was to an extent. He spoke the words of God. He said amazing things. He did miracles that nobody else could do. And how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. We had hoped. I'm sure you've all been in circumstances where you had hoped. You felt like you had a confidence that something was going to change, but then you hit that point where it's like, no. There's no hope now. We had hoped. But they give their expectations away with one word, and it's this word, redeemed. They had been expecting that Jesus was going to be the one who would redeem Israel. Now, we tend to use the word redeem as kind of like to turn around a horrible, a dire, or a tragic situation and make it something that's kind of good and healed. But the Bible tends to use it more to mean like a rescue of hostages or buying back slaves into freedom. And here's the clue as to why they can't recognize Jesus. In their minds, for Jesus to do the redeeming, the Messiah had to be alive. And, do you know, that's a fair assumption, isn't it? You know, for somebody to do something, you'd expect that they've got to be alive, right? But they were expecting him to be like a big military leader and to win a decisive liberation campaign and to free Israel from the Romans. If he's dead, he can't redeem us. Their expectations for redemption and for their Messiah were way too small and pointed in the wrong direction. They had not great enough expectations. And their confusion only kind of got amped up on that Sunday morning. Then some women from our group of his followers were at the tomb early this morning. They came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they'd seen angels who told them Jesus is alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Subtext, we are utterly clueless in this moment. We have no idea what's going on. None of our talking and discussing and talking has really got us anywhere. We're confused. And here's the thing. In their minds, Jesus was dead. All of this talk of him being alive, they hadn't seen him. They were confused and disappointed, a bit broken. And you know, if someone that you know is dead, who's the last person that you were going to expect to see? This stranger can't be Jesus because Jesus is dead. It's like confirmation bias. Now, surely at this point, Jesus could just do a kind of ta-da and make them see. But Jesus wants them to see with more than just their eyes. Now, his response in this might come as a surprise. It might sound a little bit harsh. O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Maybe you found yourself in a place of confusion and questioning. And you think that that's the kind of response that you're going to get from God. A total brush off. You complete moron. Why don't you get this? But you know, that is not at all the tone of Jesus' response here. It's much more, You're not putting it together, are you? You haven't joined the dots. You're struggling to believe what was there all along. You've hesitated to trust what God has already made clear. Jesus is not exasperated here, just like he isn't exasperated with us. He's present with them, and he's patiently moving them towards joining the dots. He's going to help them to kind of properly make sense of all of this. He isn't going to leave them in a place of misunderstanding, but now he's walking with them to show them the truth. He's going to reshape their expectations of him. And he begins to make sense of it with one necessary word. Necessary. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And you know this word, necessary? It means what must happen. There's an old English word, behooves. And I kind of feel like, and it behooves that this must happen. And I think it behooves that we start using that word again, because it's a great word, isn't it? But it behooves that this happened. All of these things that these disciples had described, the very source of their confusion, it absolutely had to happen. It was baked into the story from the very beginning. This was no accident. And you know, bless Jesus, he had been telling his followers all the way along the line, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And when he got there, none of them got it. None of them understood. I always feel like I'm in very good company when I come to the disciples. But then Jesus comes to this most dense and meaning-laden verses in the whole Bible. Like this verse here, I reckon it's got to have about 3,000 calories per slice, just like this smoked chocolate brownie with caramel sauce. Apparently it does have 3,000 calories a slice, and I think this verse does as well. You think about how dense this is. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Like, how long was this journey? Well, apparently it was about 2 hours long, so it's about the distance from Tredegar to Merthyr going along the old road, if you can picture that, okay? So he's got a whole 2 hours to unpack to them the whole of the Old Testament and to show how all of it is pointing to him. And you know, I get really frustrated by this verse, because I kind of feel like this is probably the best sermon in the Bible that was never recorded. Like, can you imagine if this had been written down? You know, Jesus rips the Old Testament, like it would have been amazing. But he walks them through this whole big story of God and his people. It's what we call the Old Testament. It's this story that explains what and who we were made for. It explains why the world and we are in such a mess and what God has done about it. It's a story that they knew, but they needed to reframe it to see how Jesus could be dead and still redeem them. And so, here's the story that Jesus is walking them through as they walk along this road in the wrong direction. God made the world through Jesus, and he made us for life with him. Relationship, trust, his presence. But the first humans, and every one of us ever since, has walked away. We chose our own way. And in doing that, when you cut yourself off from the source of life, what you experience as a consequence is death. But God promised a rescuer, one who would crush evil and the source of evil and would bring his people back. And from that point on, the whole story is pointing to the Redeemer. Now, the funny thing is, when I look at that screen at the back, the Redeemer's on that side, but on that side he's this. So I'm going to try and point to him there, because the whole story is pointing to him. And so, God chooses this family, the family of Abraham, through whom he's going to bring blessing to all nations. But the focal point of that blessing? Jesus. He's going to rescue his people from slavery in Egypt through the Exodus. But you know, the Exodus story is just pointing forward to an even greater rescue of the whole humanity through Jesus. He establishes a king, David. But David just points forward to a greater king, a king that's going to be on his throne forever. This one. And when everything falls apart for Israel, the prophets say the rescuer is coming. But he's not going to be the kind of rescuer that you expect. He's going to suffer. He will give his life to redeem his people. Jesus was always going to rescue, but it was always going to be through suffering, through dying, and rising again. And as he takes them back through this story, you can almost imagine kind of like the smirk on his face, like I can't wait for the big reveal here, as he's pointing to all of this and he's going, on the down low, that's me, and that's me, and that's me. Oh, look, there I am again. Like, as he's taking them through this story and showing how the whole thing points to him. And in all of this story, as he takes them through the scriptures, they really should have known that this was what to expect. They should have known this. They should have got this. But they weren't expecting him to be this kind of king. And they needed their inside eyes opening to the truth of a king who rules by serving, who wins by losing, and who lives through dying. This was necessary. It had to happen. And they needed to grasp it, not by what they'd seen, but they needed to grasp it by faith. Do you know, the suffering of Jesus wasn't pointless. It wasn't a random act of governmental violence. These guys had a bunch of happenings that they couldn't make sense of, and what Jesus did was to zoom out and to show them the meaning. And the honest truth is that the worst thing that happened in human history, where humans put God the Son to death in the most undignified and cruel way, was what God always intended to use to deal with the very worst thing in us. This was the plan of God, Father, Son, and Spirit. God the Son would become human, step into this world, take into himself the raging bin fire of human sin with all of its destructive and cruel impulses, bearing it, taking it, breaking its power from within, so that we could find life in him, be liberated from sin and its effects, be freed to walk in relationship with the God who created us for himself. And here's the thing. Jesus died. They'd seen it with their own eyes, but he didn't stay dead. The resurrection happened, and that was necessary. I mean, how better to show that you had defeated sin and death than by rising from the dead? That was why it was necessary. It was always meant to go down like this. We have a Savior King who has taken on himself the greatest enemy and has defeated it. And sometimes I think even the fact that Jesus won can be a barrier for us. He's a victorious king. So what does he know about my life? The truth is, he knows everything. He knows what it is to suffer in a very human body. And if you've suffered physical pain, emotional rejection, betrayal by those closest to you, Jesus knows. He empathizes. But you know what? He has also dealt with the root cause of all of that pain, and he has defeated its final power forever. But back to the story. Imagine being one of these two. As he's walking you through the history of your people, and he's showing you that everything that's happened was always meant to happen, and that this is actually really good news. I imagine like the pennies are beginning to drop. You know when you're really struggling to understand something, but like it just kind of starts to come into view, and you can imagine that the pennies are just starting to drop for them, but it's a little bit hazy still. And just when they get into that kind of tell us more moment, they arrive at their destination. And Jesus acts like he's going further, but they invite him in. And this is the moment where their closed eyes are opened. As they sit at a table with Jesus, he breaks bread. And you think, well, big deal. Actually, it was, because it was the job of the host to break bread. And here Jesus is as the guest at this table, and he's the one that breaks bread. I would imagine that pennies are now falling faster than a lucky drop on tipping point. They're kind of getting it at this point, aren't they? This stranger, this is the real host here. This table actually belongs to him. And then, flashback, they must have talked to the 11 disciples about what happened at the Last Supper when Jesus broke the bread and he said, "This is my body that was broken for you." Flashback. And in an instant, as the bread is broken, so are their wrong expectations. They see him for who he is. The restraints are taken off their eyes, and they see him. And there's this beautiful kind of huge Easter egg that Luke has hidden for us here. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve ate from a tree that God said to them, "Don't eat from that. He gave them everything else, but not this one tree. They ate, and in that moment, they recognized that they were naked. Luke uses virtually the same words here to say that Jesus broke the bread, he gave them the bread, they ate, and they recognized him. What a flip. What a reversal. And then, do you know, ironically, as soon as they see him for who he is, they can't see him anymore. He's gone. And even though they don't see him anymore, now they see, like they really see. They really get it. Did not our hearts burn within us as he opened the scriptures to us while we were walking along the road? They get it. His death and his defeat was not a defeat, but it was the source of redemption. It was his victory. And not just for Israel, but for the whole of humanity. And he is not dead, but he is alive. And if he's alive, then everything that he said was true. And so the disciples don't just sit there. Because the thing is, you know, if this is true, we've got to do something about this. Okay? If he's alive, it changes absolutely everything. And so these disciples don't just sit there. They sprint back from Merthyr to Tredegar along the old road. It's dark by this point as well. Dangerous. They don't care. They got to go. And they've got to tell people that they've seen him. And they know that he is alive. And if he's alive, then it changes everything. Do you know, I don't know what your view of Jesus is or what experiences have shaped your expectations of him. But you know, if all of this is true, then you owe it to yourself to ask the question, have I really seen him clearly? Has my view of him been shaped by the reality of who he is or more by bad experiences, by misrepresentations or misunderstandings? Because here's the invitation. Let him show us who he really is. Open our eyes to the truth that he is king, a king that rescues us from a mess of our own making. And then he shares his eternal life with us, beginning now and lasting forever. He calls us to turn from ruling our own lives, to stop trusting our own wisdom, to turn from sin, from the ways that we've chosen to live without reference to the one who created us for himself, and to come back to him and to find true life in him. And it's a free gift. You know, if you have more questions, doubts, skepticism even, Jesus stands up to every question. We run this thing called Alpha, and it's a really chilled opportunity to ask those questions. And you know, there is no question that is a stupid question, and there is no question that's a kind of rude question or off limits. Because actually, you know, if this is true, and if this changes everything, and if this is about like knowing the eternal God who created us for himself, then every question really matters. And if it's true, then he stands up to every question. And so if you're interested in asking those questions, come and nab me afterwards, and I'll point you to somebody else who can answer them. Jokes. But here's the good news. Oh, guys, right? Easter Sunday, here's the good news. He is alive. The Lord has risen indeed. It's been custom in the church for many, many years to say he is risen, and for the church to say he is risen indeed. Because he is. And this is the truth. He's still alive. He's forever alive. This wasn't something that happened 2,000 years ago and doesn't change anything about today. It changes everything about today. Do you know what? There are a stack of people in this room who I have seen the risen Jesus make alive. I have seen him transform lives. He's done it for me. He's done it for so many. And he transforms. He may not transform our immediate circumstances, but he transforms us in our circumstances, and we know him in those circumstances. He's a God who changes everything because he is still alive and he is still at work today. And you know, his resurrection is the guarantee, it's the proof of what he'll do when he comes a second time for everyone who places faith in him. Like this is, you know, in a world that is in such a mess today, this is such good news. Because what he gives us when he returns is resurrected, perfected life in him, united to him forever. No more tears, no more griefs, no more doubts, no more pain, no more questions to ask, because we'll see him face to face. And this means that our hope and our joy is anchored not in our ever-changing circumstances, but in a king who has forever loved us and who is forever with us. This invitation is for everyone. You can respond to him by turning to him, trusting him, asking him to open your eyes. And in those moments where life feels confusing, senseless, broken, the risen Jesus walks with us, assures us of his presence, and he meets us where we're at. He's alive. He's alive. And it's what he loves to do. Should we stand?